How's it going, folks? My name is KayonBurbick, and this is my current events assignment for GBA 5211 for the semester of spring 2026. So, for my article, I decided to choose one titled Integrity is Not a Buzzword: How Leaders Can Foster Trust in Uncertain Times. It was written by Isabel Markham for the Wall Street Journal, and it was published January 28, 2026. First, I'd just like to discuss some of the key concepts. First of all, one of the big things the article talked about was integrity being a responsibility, not just an ideal. So it really dove into the idea of not just being ethical for the sense of being moral and a good person, but also integrity being a responsibility for the success of your business and company. Furthermore, it talks about the lack of ethicality and morality and how that actually affects your business negatively. And then it jumps into kind of talking about how generational values have shifted and how that's kind of affecting the new work landscape. Next, it kind of dives into the perception gap between executives and employees and how there's a disconnect in a lot of companies between what the leaders think is going on and how the operations are running and how the employees actually feel about day-to-day life within the workplace. And then finally, it kind of speaks about establishing ethics in an evolving work landscape, and we'll kind of get into that a little deeper later. So first, to jump into integrity being a responsibility, first of all, in order to be successful as a company and develop this code of ethics, our leaders and executives need to be visual. The article talks about being visual on a day-to-day basis to your employees to not only demonstrate but communicate the values that you're trying to bestow upon them that hopefully they absorb and take on as their own values as well too. Secondly, you want to reinforce these values by again being visible, um, con- uh, continuously and repetitiously explaining these values and demonstrating them, and then while also giving recognition to your employees for demonstrating the values that you two are trying to put and establish within the culture of the business. And beyond going on this recognition, the article talks about how the importance of listening to your employees actually helps develop this sense of culture and integrity within your business. A lot of executives, because they're at a higher position, feel like they may not need to listen to the people that are below them, and they feel like they might have all the answers or all the power. But establishing a relationship with your employees and being able to have an open dialogue back and forth about giving suggestions or listening to, maybe changes that might be needed or benefit the whole team actually has proven to be very beneficial for establishing ethics, upholding ethics, and then giving feedback when either ethics are being upheld, aren't being upheld, and kind of, establishing more of a relationship like that. And when we kind of talk about ethics, again, like I kind of discussed in the introduction, a lot of people just think about being ethical for the sense of being a good person without really realizing that how important it is to actually the success of your business. So any type of reputation damage to your business is going to affect revenues, profits, growth. So any type of ethical lapses in certain areas can attribute to that reputational damage, which will then leak over to actually affecting business practices and business expenses and finances. Then you can get in legal and regulatory trouble as well if you lack ethical practices and lack a sense of morality. And then operational, if people are feeling like they're being discriminated against or there's some hypocrisy within a business, it could start to affect workers' performance and therefore affect business operations. So ethics is a much deeper thing in business than just being a good person. It affects the business on all different levels. And I have written here that ethics and integrity is actually a risk management tool, because if you don't have strong ethical codes embedded within your business, it's actually a risk to your business. So it's a risk management thing to have those things installed. The first article I kind of sourced besides the main article was an article on Boeing and like their failure of like kind of their corporate culture. If you remember last year, we were hearing stories all over the internet about planes that were having cracked windows mid-flight, emergency doors falling off mid-flight, 30,000 feet in the air. doors flying off of planes, and this was huge news. And it goes when people kind of hear about this, they're just like, oh, this business or these planes are having malfunctions, but it's a lot deeper than that actually. So where it kind of originated is actually an ethics issue. So Boeing kind of steered away from their engineering first kind of mentality and started focusing more on profits and more on maximizing their finances. And because of this shift from focusing on their engineering and more focusing on profit margins and stuff, they lost a lot of quality control and safety regulations and therefore led to kind of these bad things happening to airplanes mid-flight. So because of these happenings, they saw sales stagnate for the 737 Max and the 787 Dreamliner, and then you saw cancellations of orders, you saw delivery freezes. After this whole thing kind of happened, they had to basically initiate a safety tax, which was basically compensating airlines for all these flawed aircrafts, and then they had to further go into like increasing oversight costs. So because all these bad things were happening, they had to spend more money on making sure that their quality control was now revamped again. And then because of all these issues, of course, you have unhappy investors, which is going to lead to um, their market valuation plummeting, so their stock fell significantly, and then trust eroded. So all of these things kind of originated from their shift away from a strong cultural, ethical focus on their engineering of their products and making sure that safety was at the forefront. And this had a domino effect into sales, cancellations, freezes, payouts, increased spending for oversight, for safety, and then eventually, losing investors. This article was actually sourced from an article called "The Story of Boeing: Failed Corporate Culture: A Cautionary Tale of Internal Quality Controls," and this was by Mitz and Miller from 2025. Furthermore, there's now generational value shifts, so there's an increased emphasis on personal values for Gen Z and millennials. Uh, Ethical leadership is actually like a huge thing that new younger workers are looking for in companies, so it's actually like something that's being sought after. And then mission statements have always been a big thing, like an underlying statement that kind of summarizes the values of the company, and but now it's more about demonstrating more than just writing a statement. The second outsourced article that I kind of dove into was one about, again, furthermore, building off of the last thing I spoke about, is about Gen Z and millennial talent attraction. So, 44% of Gen Z and 40% of millennials are actually have rejected jobs that don't align with their personal values. So now we're starting to see ethicality and morality be a attraction to the workforce. And if you don't have that, people are actually turning down jobs. So there's a value gap between the younger generation and the older generation of people who think that just hiring for salary is enough. And now we're seeing that people are actually hiring for, or people are actually wanting to work for jobs that align with their personal values. And this further like in-depth look was actually, I found it in an article called um, Gen Z and Millennials at Work, pursuing a balance of money, meaning, and well-being, by Deloitte in 2025. And then there's a perception gap. Not only is there a value gap, there's a perception gap. So the perception gap between leaders and executives and then their employees. So it was cited in the article, my main article that I read, that 90% of executives believe that the company's values are being demonstrated on a day-to-day basis within the work environment. And apart from that, 60% of entry-level employees think that that is true. So as you can see, there's a discrepancy in the perception of what's actually going on within the inner workings of these businesses. 90% executives, 60% employees. And what as well as that, we're kind of in a shift of like the working landscape ever since COVID. During COVID, people were forced to go into remote working settings, and since we've kind of come out of COVID, a lot of those kind of footholds have actually stayed. So there's still companies that are fully remote, and then you have hybrid models where there might be people in jobs 2 to 3 days a week coming into the office or less. And then you have AI innovation. So we have these hybrid working models along with AI innovation, and it's kind of an evolving work landscape, and we're now left to kind of maneuver and figure out ways to not only establish ethical codes but maintain them and have them upheld within kind of these less traditional kind of settings. Excuse me. And the third separate article that I went out to find was one I wanted to really kind of hone in on this idea of these changes. So I found an article, called "The Effects of Hybrid Work Models on Employees and Shift of Productivity," and it's by three different authors: Castaneda, Zappos, and Temponueva. And what this article talks about is that 2 to 3 days of remote work, so a hybrid model, actually maintained or increased productivity in workers, but a fully remote model not necessarily lost productivity, but there was something that they called a knowledge loss. So all like the spontaneous in-person interactions where you might come across somebody in a break room and spark up a conversation about work, and an idea or a concept might spark from that, or a random interaction with someone passing in the hall. Those sort of interactions and those sort of sparks are being lost in fully remote work knowledge. And then they go on to talk about something about a proximity bias. Proximity bias is basically like in optional remote or come into work settings, the workers that are coming into work on an optional basis but still chosen to come in, they're actually being seen as harder workers. And because of this perception of them as harder workers and those that choose to stay at home and work, um, there's actually becoming like a favoritism between some people that come in are more favored, and then the people that stay at home are looked down upon. So there's becoming this ethical thing where leaders or executives are playing favorites because of a certain perception they might have of like people who come in and people who don't. So these different work models, these hybrid work models, executives are having to maneuver through them to really fight against these biases and kind of maintain and establish a certain level of ethics, regardless of if people are choosing to stay home or come in or whatever. And then there's a surveillance and trust thing. The more that you can see somebody and the more that someone is in front of you, the more you trust what they're doing. And the more that someone is kind of on their own doing their own work, the more you question what they're doing. So this hybrid work model has really thrown a lot of executives into kind of a loop as to how to kind of stay unbiased and establish these moral codes and things of that such. In conclusion, ethics is of the utmost importance to all growth, profits, and revenues. It's not just be ethical to be a good person. When it comes to business, ethics can, well, a lack of ethics, I should say, can greatly negatively influence your growth. It could upset shareholders. It could lead to lawsuits and a whole other different things. So it's not just ethics for the sake of being good. It's ethics for the sake of a positive business operation. And then leaders must be consistently visible and walk the talk they talk. So I'm kind of going back to the Gen Z and millennials who are looking for employees to share the same values that they have. You can't just speak it in a mission statement. You have to demonstrate it on a day-to-day basis for people to see that this is what you're really about. And then through these kind of change in working climates and through these kind of changes of values, moral codes must be defined and strictly upheld in changing, these changing environments. And then, of course, we want to shorten the perception gap between executives and employees. Um, Executive thinking that everything's all good and their employees thinking something different is very much a disconnect and a lack of being in front of your employees consistently, and a lack of communication and a lack of understanding and a lack of intertwined kind of thinking. So these ethical principles are go a lot deeper than one might think. It's not just ethics for ethics' sake. It's very much ethics for the importance and for the success of our business. So I hope all this helps. I hope this kind of gives you guys a deeper insight into the importance of business ethics. We talked about Boeing and gave an example of how the lack of ethics in kind of their shift away from the importance of quality control and stuff affected their whole entire business stream. We talked about Gen Z and millennials shifting their values and therefore having executives to shift to more emphasize and demonstrate their values. And yeah, I really hope it helped you guys kind of lock in the importance of ethics within a professional, organized business. Thank you so much.